Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of I Never Knew But My Dog Did podcast. I am Maureen Scanlon, or Life Coach Maureen, as most of you know me. I am jumping out of my skin right now because I am so excited about my next guest. I don't even know if an hour is going to be enough, but we're going to shoot for an hour. I think you guys are going to be so touched by him and his story, his enthusiasm, and his love for continuing the legacy that his parents left. So, Michael Ruskin was born Meyer Ruxin, was born in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in the beautiful city of Perth Amboy, New Jersey. That's central New Jersey. He is the youngest son of David and Dora Ruskin and the younger brother of the late Alan Ruskin. A graduate from Kent State University in Ohio, he received a BA in political science and psychology, my favorite subject, as you all know. Michael spent most of his 40-year career in corporate human resources and private consulting. Mr. Ruskin, now retired, lives a very active lifestyle, which includes travel, tennis, dancing, and hiking. He's a student of spirituality, world history, and an avid researcher. He has one niece and enjoys spending time with friends and making new ones. Aw, today you've made a new one. Michael is the last surviving member of his immediate family. He wrote a fantastic book that is blowing up. He's on this world tour, and it is called The Vow, A Love Story and the Holocaust. And it's his first book, but not his last. We hope not. And he currently is living in Roswell, Georgia. This book is a true story based on the lives of two people whose love, faith, and will to survive transcended one of the darkest periods in human history, the Holocaust. Welcome, my new friend, Michael.
Thank you, Maureen. Good seeing you. I'm glad to be here and share it with your audience. So it's wonderful.
Oh, I know my listeners are going to just absolutely love you. So here on Inc., we talk about our knee story to begin with, because the idea of I never knew is, what did you go through that you had no idea and then overcame, and all of a sudden you get these aha moments. So I'm certain you have a lot, and we talked off air of a lot of the stuff you didn't even know. But tell us, what was kind of a really impactful knee story for you?
Well, let me explain that the story itself, I looked at it as first of all, it's a spiritual book. I want to make that clear right from the start. This is a situation where I'm comparing the darkness versus the light. I'm comparing one man, a very evil man, Adolf Hitler, versus the light of my parents, who exemplified the strength of the human spirit and their unwavering love and their courage and their perseverance. And that's what kept them alive. And what's really, really important for the audience to understand is, in the country of Lithuania, where my parents were born, and all this has happened, almost 97% of the population of the Lithuanian Jews were exterminated. They were murdered in cold blood by the Nazis and the collaborators. So when you consider that almost 97% of the Jewish population of Lithuania disappeared within a 5-year period, and that two of those people who survived were my parents, I call them a miracle couple, and I call them my heroes.
Oh,
and so this information, a lot of it I didn't know until 1993, when my father passed away of a sudden illness, and I went down to Florida. I was living in New Jersey and New York. And after the funeral, my brother and I decided that we were going to sell the condo. And at that point, I went over to start cleaning up the condo, because we're going to put the condo on the market, and the real estate people were coming the next day. I went into his bedroom. I started cleaning out his bedroom, and in the bottom drawer of his night table, I found a manila envelope, and in there were documents from the doctors and the lawyers who were taking testimony from my parents. And they were going to be petitioning the German courts in 1964 for reparations for the loss of their daughter, the loss of their families, and almost the loss of themselves through this petition. And though when I read this at 11 o'clock at night, sitting on my father's bed, reading over these documents that were in German as well as in English. I was totally floored about things I never knew until I found those documents. That became the nucleus of my book. And not only that, but it's also in the book. I actually have copies of those documents in the back of the book.
Wow, I can't even imagine. I mean, the saying "knock me over with a feather" comes to mind because you think your parents and your family and your people, and then to suddenly after his passing be like, "Oh my gosh, did I really even know my parents?" And we were talking off air where you said I didn't appreciate it. Well, you didn't appreciate it because you didn't know about it. How has your love, your respect, all of those things grown since you've taken on not only the book, but the research and finding out all the probably really impactful and traumatic events?
It was very difficult. I felt a lot of guilt because I really didn't appreciate them the way I do now. They rarely spoke about. My mother mentioned one time that she had a daughter, and I didn't want, and this is when I was very young, and I didn't want to press the issue because I didn't want to open up those wounds. Rarely did they talk about their lives together. And if they did, it was only when we were sitting watching TV on these documentaries of World at War, where they were showing the Germans throwing the Jews into the concentration camp and being hauled away for extermination. And I could not fathom what I was watching on that TV screen to the people that were sitting next to me. I said, "Oh, I see it on the TV," but I didn't realize that those on the TV were well, they weren't actually my parents, but they were there. And so as I got older and I wrote the book, I realized, as the last surviving member of my media family, that I had a responsibility and actually an honor to be writing their story. And I want to make clear, this is their story and this is their book. I only stand here to speak the words that they should be speaking right now, but I'm doing it for them because they're still here, but they're not here.
Yes, yes, I love that you say that. Being that I'm a medium, I know that
Yeah.
they're here as well.
I gotta tell you really quickly, Maureen, when I was writing the book, a process on board my processor, 2, 3 in the morning, they're just, my fingers were literally racing across the keyboard with information and words I've never used before. My fingers were just running across the keyboard. I just was, whatever was coming into my head, I was putting down. The next morning I would wake up and I would look what I wrote and I said, did I really write this? To this day, I look at my book and I can't believe that I'm the one who wrote this, but it's their book. It's their.
I love that, and I resonate so much with that. I wrote my first book. My dog is more enlightened than I am, the same way. I wrote it start to finish. It was published in 8 weeks. It was, and then my husband went back and edited it, and I'm reading it, and I'm like, did I write that or did you change that? He goes, you wrote it. So I feel you so much and connect with you so much on that. You just know, we call that channeled intuitive messages,
Right.
that we're the conduit, and it comes through, and I so appreciate that.
And they're still here.
Oh my gosh,
They're still, I feel them all the time. All the time. I feel them around me all the time.
do they give you signs? Do they give you, things moving and anything?
Yeah, well, a lot of synchronicity goes on, like things they just put in my head that maybe I'm looking for, and also I open up the page and it was the page I was looking for. Things like that. I mean, I can go on and on what happened. The synchronicity. I met someone from South Africa who turned out to be my second cousin from Johannesburg. I didn't even know it until he found this book. And I met 2 cousins I never knew I had through the research that he did in South Africa, of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. So I met 2 cousins on my father's side. I never knew I had family on my father's side. All these things were coming into me, and it was because I know they're here.
Oh
I
my
know.
gosh, 100%, 100 million trillion%. And I'll know as we're talking, like I'll get full body chills and all. That's their way of validating, we're
Yeah,
here. And there
yeah,
may be something that pops up that I might say and
yeah.
say, I don't know anything about them. We don't know each other. So it's really fun. I was telling you, I lived in Germany for 4 years, and we visited the Dachau concentration camp. And I love that you said this is a spiritual book. When I walked in that concentration camp, I looked over at the ditch, and I could feel everyone that had been there. And I was there in 95, which was 50-year anniversary of Dachau.
Mm.
And what I love that you say that 97% of the Lithuanian Jewish population was wiped out. This was not just a German Jew problem. This was, you are correct. I learned so much about how many other countries. Australia lost a lot of their Jewish population. So I'm happy that you're also shedding light on that. And we talk about leaving a legacy, and you're doing absolutely amazing. So let's talk about their story. And I know I want readers or listeners and readers to go get the book, because there's going to be so much. You guys are going to want all these details, but we're going to get some cliff notes of their story and their vow and their resilience. So tell us from the beginning how you lost your sister, and how everything came to be for your parents over there.
Okay, so what happened was in 1941, when the Germans invaded the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Russians were actually in those countries. They annexed those Baltic countries when there was a pact made, a anti-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. So the western part of Europe was going to be Germans' playground, more or less. And the eastern part was going to be Stalin's and the Russians' playground. And they made a vow, a secret vow, that they weren't going to invade each other's territory. So when the Germans entered Poland and they went beyond a certain parallel in Poland, which is going to the to the east part of Poland, that's when the Soviet Union knew that this was not a good place. So, and they already invaded the Baltic countries, which was their agreement. So when the Germans arrived in Lithuania, the Russians were actually pushed out of Lithuania to go back into Soviet, because the Germans were just rolling over Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Belgium, all these countries the Nazis were taking over. So when they ended up in Lithuania, tens of thousands of Jews were killed by the locals, because there were a lot of anti-Semitism going on, because the locals believed that the Jews were collaborating. And it gets very kind of complicated. They were collaborating with the Russians for the Russians to then take them to Siberia, the locals. And so the Lithuanians had like a debt to pay, because they believed that the Jews were collaborating with the Russians, which was not true. But anyway, so what happened was when they arrived, they ended up taking a majority of the Jewish population into what they call as a ghetto. And this is where they took the Jews after thousands were killed by the locals. And they said they were going to create a safe zone in the ghetto, which is in a really downtrodden area of Kaunas, Lithuania, which is the capital at that point, Kaunas, and that's where my parents met, which we'll back up and I'll tell you about that. So they ended up taking them into the ghetto, where there was only 8,000 people, and now you had 36,000 Jews moving into the ghetto, where they would barbed wire the town, and then they would throw them crumbs, a piece of bread, maybe some meat once in a while, some vegetables, but it was very limited. They couldn't grow their own crops. Moving back again, I want to say when they first arrived, they were told to put on a Star of David on the front of their lapel, on the back, to identify them as Jews. They were not allowed to walk on the street. They had to walk in the gutter. They were not to socialize or mingle with any Christians. They were to give up all their books, all their typewriters, and all this other information that they had to give them up. And if anyone was to harbor a Jew, they were going to be immediately killed. And so they were then put into the ghetto, and they were looking at 36,000 people, where the apartments were taken by 2 to 3 families at a time. Two of the families were people that moved into my parents' apartment. And so once they barbed wired the town, they had all the people inside this confined area barbed wired in. They were then put into work details. Now, one of the key things about the book that people need to know is that the Germans wanted to work the Jews to death. That's where so the Jews were working for the military machine of the Germans. And so the German hierarchy said, we're going to take the Jews and have them work like 18-hour days, 4 hours of sleep, not feed them. And a lot of them just died that way because they just were exhausted. So when they were in the ghetto, Maureen, what they had these raids into the apartments by the German SS, unannounced raids. They were to invade the apartment buildings, take the jewelry, take the money, take the appliances, take the furniture, anything of value those Germans took out of the apartments that the Jews were occupying. Anybody who complained were either taken away or beat up. This was going on for nearly 3 years because they actually took over in 41. It lasted till 44. So they would have these repeated raids into the house, and they would take anything they wanted, and then they would sell it to either the locals or they would take it for themselves. My parents' engagement ring and wedding ring was taken off their fingers. And this is what's going on. Now, the last raid, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because it's in the book, and it's the hardest chapter for me to write because it's about the children. In March 27th, 1944, they had what they called Kindernacht. It was the children's action. It was the time they would end up going into the apartments, not looking for furniture, appliances, money. They were looking for the children. Why were they looking for the children? Because they're getting ready to liquidate the ghetto and take the remaining people to the concentration camps. One was Dachau. That was one of the last raids. And they also wanted to take the children away from their parents because it encumbered the mothers from doing work because they had to take care of kids. They figured if we get rid of the children, the women could work even harder because they don't have the children to raise. And the last reason is because it would wipe out another generation of Jews that the Germans didn't want. The Germans looked at the Jews as almost like, it was like racial bias. It was like they were not pure. They were evil people. And they found propaganda, like the Germans lost the First World War, they blamed it on the Jews. The economy was bad, they blamed it on the Jews. Everything was blamed on the Jews by Hitler and the propaganda machine that was running Berlin at the time. So that was another reason why the Germans came in, is because they wanted to get rid of another generation, because to them it was about having an Aryan race, a pure race, and the Jews were just going to diminish the quality that the Aryans were going to give the world. And they found the Jews to be a threat. So during that raid, the children's raid in 1944, which went down in history as one of the most tragic events of World War II, they were taking the children out of the apartments. They would have, I go into it in the book, they would end up having the Germans coming into the apartments and grabbing the children in front of their parents. In my mother's case, and this is in the documents that I found in my father's night table, my sister Rose Miriam was 3.5 years old. She was literally taken out of the arms of my mother. They were hiding underneath the floorboard in their apartment. And my father, when they were living there, dug what they call a spider hole inside the floorboard of the apartment. This is all in the documents. And they were down there just in case the Germans, they could hide down there. So when they came into the apartment, there'd be no one there to find, and they just go on to the next apartment. That's what almost happened. But what problem was that about 2 hours after the raid was over on these apartments, they took the children, put them in trucks, and they wheeled them into the extermination facility that used to be a prison back in the 1800s by the Russians, and they would shoot the kids. We're talking children under the age of 12. So my mother was underneath the floorboard with my sister, and they were hiding down there thinking that the raid was over, but then all of a sudden, you'll hear in my book, and I don't want to give away too much of the book, but they came back into the apartment, and my sister began to murmur. She was only 3.5, and they found them underneath the floorboard. So they open up the floor, and then they shine a light down the hole. They take my sister and my mother out. And then there was a struggle by the SS with my mother. They grabbed Rose right out of my mother's arms. And then when she went running after them, he turned around with the butt of his rifle and knocked my mom out on the floor. This is all in the documents. It was the hours later, my father came back from his work detail, and he found my mother in the room. The next door apartment neighbors took her back into the room. They never saw my sister again.
Oh, has there been any documentation of what happened to any of these children that they've uncovered in since?
Yeah. Well, no, they were all shot and then buried over.
Okay.
They dug pits. Now, what was and as you'll read through the book, there would be so few people that could have survived even that.
Yeah.
But what happened within 3 months after that event, Maureen, they were sent to separate concentration camps, and that's where the vow comes in. They were liquidating the ghetto, and a lot of my book focuses on the ghetto more than the camps, because that's where people don't understand how many people were killed in the ghettos all over Europe. They did this in major cities. They would take the Jews and put them in ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto, there would be ghettos all over Europe, because that's how they can segregate the Jews from, and not only Jews, but there were also others put in the ghetto than everybody else. So here it is. This happened on March 27th. My parents were being shipped to Dachau and Stutthof, which are separate concentration camps. One is in Poland, one is outside of Munich. And they made a vow on the train platform before they were to be separated, and they did not know where they were going. When they were put on those boxcars, the Germans said you were being resettled for your own safety. They did not tell them where they were going. So the women and the girls were going into a certain train on one track, and then my father and the boys were going on another track in opposite directions. So on the train platform, and this is why it's called the vow, my parents made a second vow. The first vow was in 1938, that if either one were to live, they were to go back to Kaunas to see if the other one was still alive. That was the last thing. And so you could see them separating in the book. I talk about how they're separating, going into these boxcars where many were killed because they had overcrowded boxcars. They didn't have any facilities. They couldn't breathe. They had to stand with their arms straight up in the air because there were so many people packed into these boxcars. So my mother went to Stutthof and my father went to Dachau, and for 8.5 months, they didn't see each other. And one of the reasons why my parents had such a love for each other is because they suffered together and they suffered apart. And sometimes when a couple suffers, it brings them even closer together when they come home. And that's what kept their love together for 55 years.
Yeah.
You can imagine, from losing their child to be putting into boxcars, going to separate concentration camps only 3 months after their own daughter was taken away from them. I don't think many people would have made it.
No, that level of trauma is, I mean, in our minds today, unbearable. And I think history is important. And I'm a big history buff for the fact that we need to carry that stuff forward so we never repeat history in the darkest parts of history. But we can continue, like you said, the legacy and the light. And yeah, there's no time to grieve. There's no time. They were in actual strict survival mode. That's all it was. So when
faith and having the faith.
Oh, and believing that we're going to stay alive and we're going to find each other again, and having hope. I think if that's the bottom line of anything of I Never Knew, is hope will carry you through. Hope will make you the most resilient and brave human because you have something to aim for. It's when we're aimless and we're hopeless that we give up, right?
Right, because the future is very compelling. The future that you're looking forward for, the future where you can actually come together and build a life together. And that's where the courage, the perseverance, and that is the strength of the human spirit. And that's what I leave my audience, is that if my parents were able to do this after all they went through, you can imagine you can do the same thing by just tapping into that spirit side of you.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, anybody has a hardship or circumstance. How could it even come close to what my parents had gone through? But they made it. You
Yeah.
can do the same thing. And this is what I leave my audience with, because they have something to take home.
Absolutely. That is definitely the takeaway is what someone had made a comment about your books that says it's a love story which celebrates the strength of the human spirit and a message for humanity to remember. And that just, oh, I got full body chills reading that. That was what I was like, that's it. That's everything. And just knowing that you bring this message, and that's what this is. This is their message. So did they get back together? Did they meet up? Tell us. I have to know. You can't leave us hanging on go read the book. I have to know so I
All
feel
right. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because you're hitting on some of the most dramatic parts of the
of
book.
course I
But
am. I always ask the hard questions, but you're here, so I'm assuming that we got back together because we had to create you.
very observant. Yeah, very astute of you. Yeah, they did meet up, and the way they met up is another incredible story of God coming down on my parents, and they truly are. I call them the shining light of World War II. As bad as it was, they shine the light on the best comes out of people when they're in a terrible situation. And my parents were a perfect example of that. So what happened was this: they didn't see each other. My father was traveling after he was given the green light to leave the hospital because he was liberated by the Americans. And I call that chapter the mission. Was his mission. And so he would be traveling through all these different displacement camps. I'm not sure if you know what a displacement camp is. When there was liberation, many of the Jews didn't want to go back to their hometown because they had no hometown to go back to. Or the Russians took over their towns. They didn't want to go back to communism. So they stayed in these displacement camps where they were going to immigrate to the United States, to South America, to Israel, to Australia, to England. And they were waiting for visas. They were waiting for sponsorship. They were waiting for someone in these countries to sponsor them to come into the country. So when my father was liberated, he would travel from one displacement camp for about 6 weeks to another, finding out whether my mom was in one of these camps because he believed that if she was still alive, she was also going to be traveling back to Lithuania to find him. So he would go back to these displacement camps, finding out if the women of the Kovna ghetto were in there, and they were not. And this was going on for weeks. He would be walking. He would taking buses. The GIs would pick him up and travel and take him to the next town. And he finally got into Poland. And he's walking down the street to this cafe. And then you got to remember, then the war was over, burned out buildings, blown up buildings. There was very little there. But he saw a cafe at the end of the street. And he was walking to the cafe because he just arrived in the one displacement camp in Białystok, Poland. And he walked down the street and he saw this man coming towards him with another man. And he was speaking Yiddish, which is the form of German and Polish. And he recognized his voice as he was coming down the road, coming down the street. And he turned, and that man who walked by him was the man in the apartment building next to theirs that picked my mother up off the floor after my sister was taken out of her arms. He picked her up with his wife and took my mother into the apartment. And so he turns and he said, "Sam, is that you?" And they thought that each other were dead, and they went crazy. They didn't realize that they were still alive. So they hugged, and it was like a reunion. They hadn't seen each other in so long, they thought the other one was still dead. So as they were talking, he said, "I saw Dora," which is my mother. And my father said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, she was here just a couple hours ago. She was going to an infirmary. She ended up with typhus fever, and she was going there for treatment." And my father, obviously, all these weeks looking for my mother, I mean, he was like, he couldn't even finish the sentence. He was already running down the street because Sam told him exactly where the infirmary was. It was a blown out warehouse that they turned into a hospital. So he gets into I go into a lot of detail in this chapter because it's incredible. So he goes in there and he goes up to the nurse and says, I'm looking for my aunt was with my mom through this whole thing. They were actually together through the whole experience. And so she said, no in the beginning, but then said, well, go up to the second floor. There could be someone up there, because this woman started a later shift, this nurse. But anyway, let me just fast forward and tell you this. When they finally reunited, my mother did tell me this. She was hours away from death with typhus. She was running a very, very high fever, and my father thought she was not going to make it. And so my mother told me she gained consciousness for just a bit, and she looked up and she saw my dad, and she says to him, David, are we in heaven? She thought my father was an angel who would come back and take my mother. She said, and then my father started crying. And of course, it was like she was hallucinating. And of course, my father was so ecstatic that she was still alive, at least then, because he didn't know that she'd make it. But she told me that she looked up at him. She thought that my father was an angel. I thought that, wow, that was incredible. And that's one little piece she told me my whole life. So anyway, so the way it's built up, it was an amazing coincidence. There's no coincidence, but it was the synchronicity of them that my father found Sam walking down the sidewalk, and then he found her in this makeshift infirmary down the street.
Oh, I love it. You said synchronicity, not coincidence. There are no coincidences, people. There's only intentions that are meant for us, and how it's going to synchronize for our good, for our greater good. Oh my gosh, so we end up having them somehow come over to America. Tell us how.
No, there's a whole big part there that I got.
I know, I don't want to like give your book away. I feel bad because I'm like, so where'd they go from there, from the hospital then? Were they able to go back to Lithuania?
Okay, so let me tell you quickly what happened, because this is a very good part of the book. Now we're going into the more uplifting part of the book. My mother and my father moved to a displacement camp outside of Munich called Fehrenwald.
Okay.
And this was a camp of about 4,500 people. And by the way, as you said, Maureen, they were not all Jewish people. There were Catholics, and there were gypsies in there. There were all from all walks of life that were in these camps. So my mother and my father moved in displacement camp, and I will tell you that my mother was a school teacher. She spoke 6 languages. She spoke 4 languages by the time she finished high school. My mother was brilliant. So when they got to this camp, my mother and a few of the teachers in there opened up the school inside the displacement camp for hundreds of children and some adults. Now, and I found this photograph on the Yad Vashem website, which is the Holocaust Museum in Tel Aviv, more or less, at the World Remembrance Center in Jerusalem. I'm sorry, in Jerusalem. And I found this on their website, a picture of my mother and all her children, all her students in this photo, and I just flipped out. So what happened was, and this is really cool, my mother began teaching, started the curriculum, got all the students together. She spoke to them in different languages. She was heralded by being a great teacher and friend. She ended up in 1947 meeting General Eisenhower, who turned out to be the 34th president of the United States. And I got a picture out of my parents' family album, is a picture of my a picture of my brother in his baby carriage at the age of 6 months old. And the baby carriage is situated in front of General Eisenhower and a bunch of dignitaries around him, celebrating my mother's devotion to the children. And she was given an honorary award, an honorarium for being one of the teachers that started the school. And so, and she told me this too, though. She did tell me that she was given flowers, and she didn't make a speech she didn't mention anything about General Eisenhower. When I found that photo, which was like 2 by 3 inches wide, I took a magnifying glass and I had to look at it. I said, holy crap, this is General Eisenhower. And my brother's baby carriage, and he's crying, and you'll see it in the book. My brother's crying in his baby carriage, and General Eisenhower is right behind him. I mean, I'm sure if this picture went out, I could, no, it would be, no, this is the only photo that I have the photo. So, it's mine. But I mean, it's an incredible photograph. So my mother made a presentation and she was honored among UN people, some military people, and she was honored for the service that she gave to the school and to the displacement camp. So that was a great piece. So my brother was born in 46. And there are pictures in the book. You could see my mother still wearing the same coat and my brother still in the same baby carriage. And I'm telling you, this book is, now that I look at it, it's just an incredible book. I mean, I have to say that myself. It's really incredible. And of course, the response I'm getting is just overwhelming because now I'm in Europe.
Oh my God. Yeah. Heck yeah. Say it. Yeah. Shout it from the rooftop.
Yeah. Well, I'm doing, this is going to be an international, I'm hoping to have it be an international bestseller. At least I'm hoping. I don't want to sound too presumptuous, but it's now in Europe. It's now in England and Australia. I spoke in the Ukraine about 2.5 weeks ago on a podcast, and a lot of this is on my website. You can go to my website, go to the media page. You'll see a lot of the podcasts I've already done and more yet to come. But it's an incredible story.
I'll have all of those links too, and we'll tell everyone how to get your book because there's only one place, listeners, so you have to go to the website only. So, oh my gosh, it's just, my heart is just so full. All I could think of when you were speaking was just, there's special people and then there's exceptionally special people, and I just think of these angels on earth that they were, and the destiny that they had for us to be talking about this many years later. When I went over to Germany, the wall had just come down, and so it came down in November. I went to Germany in May, and I remember we did go to Berlin and we visited, and I didn't know that history. And I think it's something we need to teach. And I think outside of the classroom, to have books like this from a more emotional attachment and personalized view of just two people who went through this. I think what you've done here is beautiful. It's a great tribute. It's also a great teaching tool to say we can see these signs before this ever gets out of hand again in the future, if that were to happen.
Well, my main audience, Maureen, are the high school and the college students, because I'm telling you, as I make my presentations, it's shocking how many students know nothing about what happened back then. They don't even know what the word Holocaust means. They don't even know where Lithuania is. They don't even know who Adolf Hitler is.
I have a 15-year-old grandson at home, and he is a history buff, thank goodness. And I'm really looking forward to him reading the book, because I think as much as he does enjoy history, to see it from a different perspective like this is going to be so impactful. And I think that's what makes the difference today, is when it's more impactful and it's not just a history assignment in a classroom. So no. I love what you're doing. So
go ahead.
So where do we go from there? So
okay, so what happened? Yeah, so they ended up in 1948. My mother received a letter from my grandfather's brother who lived in Brooklyn, giving them sponsorship. At the same time, my father's side of the family had a cousin in Johannesburg, South Africa, who owned a textile factory. And he wanted my dad and my mom to come to South Africa. I could have been a South African. But it didn't happen that way. But anyway, so my mother won out. Obviously, she won. She wore the pants in the family. So, I mean, my mother was brilliant, I have to say. She's 4'11", a little tiny lady, but incredibly strong. I mean, the woman is, well, obviously, well, look what she went through. Yeah. So anyway, so they ended up getting on a boat or ship, I would think. And they traveled about 8 days through rough waters, and they landed in Ellis Island, New York. And I described how they see the skyline and the lights on the buildings. It's just, it was in May and the sun was going down. It was just a really terrific description of how they landed in Ellis Island. And there at the gate, by the customs gate, there was my Uncle Max and his wife, and they greeted my parents. And they moved into Brooklyn, New York with my great uncle for a number of years. I was born in Brooklyn. And then they came to New Jersey, and my father was an electrician. And by the way, in the book, I talk about one of the reasons my father was kept alive in the Dachau camp was because his job, not only for the electrical work he was forced to do in the camp, he was also responsible for taking the bodies off the electrical fences that the Jews and others were trying to escape, or they were committing suicide.
Wow.
So he then had to take the bodies off the fences and put them into gurneys or put them on wheelbarrows and wheel them into the crematorium, and that's where they were burned. So you can imagine the post-traumatic stress my parents had all through their lives was just unbelievable.
But it's interesting that they didn't talk about it. So did you ever see any signs of
Yeah,
any depression, anything like that?
obviously so. Yes, I did, but I didn't realize I was too young. I just didn't know. I will tell you this, my mother was extremely protective. She would walk me to school in the morning up to the time I was in second grade, hand in hand, go to the school. She would get out of work early and stand in the playground waiting for me to come out at 3 o'clock, and she would walk me home while all my playmates, my friends, were walking with their buddies.
And we can see why. We can understand
Yeah,
why.
right.
Yeah.
So she was
Oh.
extremely protective, and she was that way through many, many years. It wasn't only that, but I mean, even when I wanted to break out, she always wanted me to be who she wanted me to be, like go to a yeshiva, which is a Jewish day school, and she wanted me to become like my family, my grandfather and my ancestors. A lot of them were rabbis. They were rabbinic scholars. My grandfather was a rabbi. So she came from that kind of family. Instead, I'm playing baseball, I'm playing football, I'm doing all the kids an American kid would do in 1950s, and she wanted to take it. And so there was a lot of this coming on. They were going head to head with each other because I wanted to just be a kid.
Yeah, yeah. Well, without that deeper understanding, that more all of that knowledge that you have now, it's the I never knew moment. Like I didn't know, we could, and I think that's kind of the key, not to be off subject, but actually more on subject, is we don't know what people have gone through. They haven't shared their innermost stories and pains and traumas. And so I think that's a great example of, man, I had really strict, mean parents. No, look what they went through, and they had lost a child. So I think that's a really great message to take from this as well, to say, you don't know what people have been through and why they behave the way that they do, where it's
Well,
coming from.
my parents were very secretive, and when I would want to go out to play, she would say to me, "Don't tell anybody that we're refugees." And they had the broken European, that the Yiddish accent.
Yeah.
If they were here now, they'd be able to show it. But I mean, so anyway, so they didn't want to know. But obviously, they had such heavy accents. How could you not know that they were not refugees? Of course, you know. They don't have their English is hard. They had a very broken English.
Yeah.
So and they were, as I said, they were very protective, and they ate very fast. So we'd sit at the table and eat. They would eat really fast because they didn't have any food in the camps, and that stayed with them their entire lives.
Wow.
And I didn't speak a word of English until I got into the second grade. I spoke Yiddish to these kids in this class. They thought I was from Mars. They didn't know what I was saying because in the house we spoke Yiddish.
Wow.
And
Okay.
my parents didn't want me to understand anything. They would speak to each other in Hebrew.
Wow. Well, yeah, your mother with 4 languages that
Yeah.
she could pick and choose whatever she wanted to say to you in these different languages. I love that, how that carried forward. And without that understanding, it's, we just accept our families as they are, and without this deeper knowledge, it's funny now, but you look back, hindsight 2020, and it's like, well, no wonder. But I think it's so beautiful. So what have you carried forward for your family, or what do you think, if they were sitting with us right now at this very moment, what is the one thing, now that they know, what is the one thing that you think they want the world to know in 2023 that it didn't know in 1944?
What I know?
What would they, if they were sitting with us today in 2023, What would they think we need to know in the world today as opposed
Oh,
to 1944?
it's all about love, and it's all about faith, and it's all about believing in yourself, and it's all about loving yourself as much as you love others and treat people the way you want to be treated. Now, I will tell you that I never had family, and I never got married. And I will tell you the one thing I've learned is that love and family are everything. And I kind of choke up when I say that because I don't have family, and I think a lot of that had to do with the way I was raised. That whole hovering, smothering thing that my mother did, but I don't want to put any blame. It was my decision. I was just very immature, and it just didn't work out. But I will say, to them, it was a sense of having faith and knowing that regardless of how dark things may appear to be, if you just believe that there's a higher power to help you, you will get through it. And that's what they believe. You can imagine that, not seeing one another for nearly 9 months, not knowing if the other one was still alive, how much faith you have to have that there's a reason to stay alive for your spouse, and you were going to have a good life together once they got back together. It's incredible the strength that these two people had.
Oh,
Truly.
yeah. Existing in fear every single minute of survival, day to
Right.
day.
And their
And
spouse. And the
yeah,
spouse.
right. I'm going to disagree with you. You do have family. You have me, and you have every single listener
Oh,
here. And
thank you.
family
Oh, very sweet. Thank you.
family is not always blood, but the people that you choose to cross paths with you and who get you, who really love you and get you. And I feel that connection with you. And so you doing what you're doing to carry that legacy on, there's going to be so many souls affected, and so many people just, that's going to be their book, that every time they're going through something, a hard time, they need to pick that book up, keep it on the nightstand, and just open that up and say, if they could do that in what they're going through, there's nothing so bad in my life that I can't be that resilient, that I can't make it over that hump.
Right.
I just think you're absolutely amazing. Let's do the commercial part of it. Let's get you all the promotions that you want. Where can everyone find you? Can they comment? Can they, every
Yeah.
aspect of getting a hold of you, or having you come speak at the high schools or the colleges as well?
Well, they could reach me on my website. That's www. The Vow a Love Story. That's VOW. TheVowALoveStory.com. There you will find my email address, Michael@TheVowALoveStory.com. They can reach me on Facebook, TheVowALoveStory.com. They can reach me on Instagram, the same thing. Um, I am open for speaking, and I do a lot of that. They could reach me for appointments, contacting me directly through my website. I'm also now moving into writing people's memoirs. That's the next big step for me, is that I'm going to be writing people's stories, their life stories, their family stories, and I'm going to do it with me and a few other people. It's called lifetimestories.net. I'll be having another company. So I'll be writing other people's stories. And of course, they could see my book, and I'm excited about writing another person's life history or their family's history. It should be really a lot of fun.
What a
Uh,
great path for you. What a great purpose. I mean, look how everything comes from something.
yeah,
You think of where it started, and those steps and those moments of tragedy and trauma that your parents went through, and now, here you are, the ripple from that. And lifestories.net, I think, just from your book alone, it shows how dedicated you are to doing the research and really getting to the core of who your parents were, and how you'll get to the core of who other people are, and really make it such an impactful way to tell someone's story, because our lives are a story. We're the dash, right? From your birthday to your death date, your dash is your story. And let's celebrate, listeners. Whatever our story is, if you have a story, contact him. And on the podcast notes on the episode, I'll have that. We are on YouTube. I'll have it on LinkedIn. I'll have it on Facebook, all the good places. So you'll be able to get a hold of Michael. And I just can't thank you enough for being here and gifting me an hour of your life that is invaluable and priceless, and sharing your parents' beautiful story. They're on my mind, and they're going to be with me all day today because I feel them. So thank you so much, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hold on. All right, a little housekeeping, guys. Love you all for listening. Thank you for being here this week. I'm so grateful, as always, for you being here and engaging, giving those wonderful reviews. We still are at 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. We're increasing our audience. We're up to about 20,000, I think. So keep sharing it, keep building the community, because these are stories you're not going to hear anywhere else, because I only attract and bring the people who have the most impactful stories for you, that will resonate, that will help, that will give you hope, and that will inspire. And that's what I Never Knew But My Dog Did is all about, and what I'm all about. I'm here for you, as always, for any coaching, anything when it comes to life coaching, whether it's overcoming trauma, whether it's relationships or dating, or just anything that involves your life that just doesn't sit right now, and you're recognizing it needs to change to get out of the insanity cycle. You know where I am, lifecoachmaureen.com. And I also do public speaking. So I am available. I have my media page there as well. Don't forget my books. My dog is more enlightened than I am, and my dog is my relationship coach. Last but not least, mydogiseverything.net, where we have nothing but healthy, fun, homeopathic gifts, clothing, all kinds of gifts for your well-deserving furry babies. So ending this week, I love you all. Take care of yourself, take care of each other. Most of all, please take care of those furry babies, and let's adopt and not shop. Until next week, everyone, take care.